So, and the idea that we can change our perspective or our situation might start, and it's going to sound a little odd, with a defense of words and ideas and language. Because if you can teach people about these things, then maybe we can begin to change some of that language. But first, people have to pay attention to the fact that language is power, which means that you actually have to get into what the Greeks would call episteme. And so here's one of the words I used in the title of this section. And the Greeks had these two terms that they used to divide the world. Right? And because we're inheritors of the Greek tradition, because we live in the Greek tradition, we've taken on this particular division, and it's still very, very strong with us. We've strengthened it. The Greeks are the classics, and the neoclassics, basically through the Enlightenment, strengthened this idea, this idea of this separation. Right? In the Greek world, the words were episteme, from which we get epistemology, which is the study of how we know things, which is crucial, right? So philosophy is epistemology, an epistemological study. Anthropology is epistemological study. History is, to an extent, epistemological, in the sense that it examines how is it we get to know what we know. Most studies, sociology, psychology, media studies, English studies and or literature studies, studies of art and culture, are studies of how do we know what we know. And that's why the humanities are absolutely crucial to us as human beings, because there's the way there's making things and making things happen and working on the body, the physical body, and all that stuff, and then which is sort of the hardware of the world, and then there's the software of the world, the cultural software that runs things, and that's run by how we think we know what we know, because we don't really know how we know. We've got guesses about it, but we don't actually know what's going on in the brain. You know, we are, when it comes to the brain, we've got, this much knowledge, and the brain is this big. We know this much about it, and we haven't been at it for very long. And you think about it, neurological studies of any sophistication haven't been going on for really more than about, I don't know, at most probably 100 years, which is nothing, right, compared to how long we've been on the planet. So there's this episteme, and with it epistemology. Right? Let me just try lightening things up there. Okay. And then on the other side, because this is a binary, whether or not it's an acceptable binary to you, it doesn't really matter. It's a binary that we still use, and the campus is organized this way: episteme and techne. And techne, in our world, we've divided into the humanities, episteme, how do we know what we know, and the technical, even though that's not really a good translation of, or not really. There are other words that come up with techne. They include things like craft. They also include art of different kinds. It's like one of those complex ideas. So when a university and a federal government, say, puts all its effort into STEM and says we're only about STEM, we're just putting money and power into techne. We want more doctors, more engineers. We want more people who do math, although math is also deeply epistemological and philosophical. But you're not doing it for that. You're doing math so you can make so you can crunch the numbers. So basically, you can develop new systems which are going to be the underpinning for computer science, which is going to teach you how to make things run faster and so on. Okay, so computer science, biology, genetic structures, all the sort of, this is how the body works, this is how the physical world works, engineering, how to make stuff, how to make it better, faster, so on. the technological, the quantitative, the scientific, the business model of understanding the world, which doesn't necessarily have, the thing about the business model of understanding the world is that you don't necessarily understand the world to understand it. You understand it so you can manipulate it and make it play for you, basically, so you can speed it up. Right? And generally, techne is what corporations need in order to function, because the world generally looks at episteme and thinks that's junk. You know, you know what? I used to go on the radio. Oh man, in the beginning of the century, you know, I'd be on the radio, occasionally usually talking about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and sometimes I'd be on with a politician, and they would say, "Well, you're just a professor." We would be talking in there and debating, and at some point they would just lose patience with me and say, "Well, you're just a professor. You know, you're just an academic. You don't actually do anything. You know, you're just a teacher." And I was like, "Yeah, that's true. I never said I was a soldier or, you know, a corporate. You know, I never said I ran a corporation. I chose this. You know, what are you what are you trying to suggest?" So, you know, if you want to sing and write and act and dance and paint and sculpt and create things and do pottery and textiles for a living, what are you, a hippie nutcase? You know, what do the engineers say, right? ERTW, right? Here, I'll put a slide in of that. And so my question to us is, well, should they? I mean, is this how it should be? Because when you put technocrats, and by the technocrat is a particular individual or a particular position, and if you want to look at this, have a look at John Kenneth Galbraith's book, The New Industrial Society. The third edition, there may be at least the third edition. I think he's done the fourth or fifth edition. Get that one, basically. Get the most recent edition you can get. I think he went back before he died and revised it again. But at least the third edition. And he talks about the technocracy, and it's a really, Galbraith is very readable. He's Canadian, hey, you know, and again, it's sort of the kind of political economy that, you know, even somebody like me can get their head around. I'm like, oh yeah, hey, I get this. You know? So, you know, should technocrats be in charge of who gets stuff? Should technocrats decide, as they do, that, for instance, caring labor, to go back to what I was talking about in the last lecture, the caring labor is going to be freed because women do it. Or that if you pinkwash a specialty, basically, that it's worthless then. You know, so PR has now been successfully pinkwashed by the marketplace, so that women mostly wind up going into PR, and people are like, whatever, you know, you're just selling something. You're just like, well, if a man was selling it and they were selling like, you know, if they were selling, let's say, electric cars to the world on a space program, we would say, well, that person's a genius, you know, or we would elect them president. Even more, you know, hey, you're selling bad real estate. Let's elect you president, even though you've had 3 failed businesses. Hey, you know, how does that work? What's the logic of that? Well, the logic of it is broken logic, right? It's illogic. Should technocrats be allowed to use the whole planet to create a murder machine which winds up killing people who have no protection from it, basically, because they're not soldiers, they're civilians. We're killing civilians now, right? Well, we have been all along. So look at how easily we fall for the danger game of Condition Orange. And Condition Orange, it's interesting to see this language coming back in, because I think it was in California or Oregon, they began using the oranges, you know, Condition Orange, Condition Yellow, Orange, Red, again, to talk about, you know, how bad things were in terms of COVID. Well, we went through this with the 2 wars. And so here's the slide of Condition Orange. And for the longest time that I can remember, we were always at Condition Orange. I never actually heard about a condition being lowered to yellow, and I certainly never had the condition being lowered to green, because it's propaganda. If you lower a condition to green, what do you have it for? The idea is to make people frightened, and then you can get them to do what you want. So I want to ask the people who were so convinced about Afghanistan and Iraq, especially the people at Western, especially the people in London who say we're so convinced. Well, do you feel safer now? You got your way, right? I mean, despite the, you know, 80 to 100 hardy individuals that kept coming out Sunday after Sunday to protest the bloody wars in the first winter. Oh God, that was a cold winter. The winter of 2002. Oh man, that was cold. We got out there every Sunday and we marched around looking like a bunch of idiots. And Londoners were like, "What's that? You know, like what? You know, what are they crazy?" It's like, well, I want to ask, so we didn't get our way. People who wanted peace and negotiation and wanted the UN to be allowed to finish their work in checking out whether or not there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq by the time we get to 2002. Well, we didn't get our way, so the people who wanted two wars got their way. So how do they feel? We had the two wars. So we killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. We destabilized two countries. And a whole part of the planet. Are you feeling better? Are things good? Because I personally would feel better if I'd known that we had, say, committed ourselves to worldwide free education programs, clean water, basic foodstuff provisions, subsistence farming or crop farming, not cash crop farming, but farming, food materials instead of, say, opium in Afghanistan. Unfettered access to health care, preventing the slash and burn farming for beef, which we can't afford to grow. I'd feel a lot safer, actually, if we truly committed ourselves to that over the last, say, what is now, it's quite terrifying. It's now 19 years. Instead of doing what we really did, which is spending, we think that the war's cost, and now this is in really 2016 dollars, $3 trillion. To wreck two countries, about which we know really nothing. What do we know about Iraq or Afghanistan, for that matter? Except that it's interesting enough to see the Russians supporting the Mujahideen fighting, they're now called the Taliban, again, fighting the West. Where that seems to sort of be a game that goes back and forth. The West supports the Mujahideen against the Russians. And then we went back in 2001 to Afghanistan, and now it looks as though the Russians have been supporting the Mujahideen fighting us for the last number of years. And people are like, I wonder if that's terrible. It's like, well, the United States, people are like, I really like Tom Hanks. It's like, I'm done with Tom Hanks. And I'm kind of done with Julia Roberts, too. These two idiots that made Charlie Wilson's War, Charlie Wilson's war was basically this war. It was the support of the Mujahideen against the Russians. They were supporting, and it was an illegal weapons trade. And Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts made a comedy out of it. Hilarious. Funny. Wonderful. 1 star. If I could give it, as they say on Amazon or Yelp, if I could give it no stars, I would. 1 star for shipping. Because that's what we bought. A lot of death. Some kind of government in Iraq run by the wealthy for the wealthy. I mean, the press has stopped covering Iraq as a story because there are no Americans there anymore. Well, there are very few Americans anymore. And a guarantee of a new ongoing war with another bunch of people because the war with ISIS came out directly out of the war with Iraq, where there hadn't been a problem. We then created one, and ISIS was a lot grimmer than the Taliban. The Taliban were bad news, ISIS was worse news. And so we gave them a chance to, we created that, we created that sort of excess, I guess. If people near them had food and water and jobs and things like that, they wouldn't have had to take money and be fighters. People took money and were fighters because there was no other game in town. If your family is starving, you haven't eaten for 2 weeks, and you can't farm because there isn't enough infrastructure to provide you with water and so on. You can't buy seed and anything like that. Then if somebody rolls into town and says, "I'll give you $100 American a month if you fight with us," you're like, okay, that's what I'm going to do. So the basic stuff that doesn't add up on the global balance sheet because it isn't sexy or high tech and doesn't have a fast turnaround time on the marketplace, so bread, water, protein, education, it's like nobody cares about that. You can't sell that stuff. There's no money to be made by people growing food and getting an education. That's what are you talking about? We got a stock market to run here. Where there is and what there is a living. But nobody wants to just live. Not in the West, do they? Every ad I see, and this appears to be true across the world, is for something more, because more means better. And this is, as I say, this is the way. This is the way. Okay.